Hello, everyone, and so let's pick up with how researchers realize the importance of stories. So I went through all of this, and this leads us now to our next bit of the crisis of representation. So out of that comes this need to resist the colonialist, sterile research impulses of authoritatively entering a culture. Okay, so ultimately, autoethnography is one little offshoot from the crisis of representation, like I said, and it emerges in ethnographic research first. Okay, and so the original way you would do an ethnography is you would research a little bit, you would discover that a culture exists, and then you would just go there. You would go there, you might get permission, you might not, and you would go, you would hang out, you would observe, you would write notes, you would participate, and then you would leave. And you would write your stuff up and you would publish it, and then you might never go back. There was no accountability to the group that you would spend time with, and oftentimes these researchers would come in, do what they wanted to do and leave, and it would impact the group. You know, sometimes they would actually get accepted into the group, and then when they left, it wouldn't, you know, they would sort of leave the group hanging, like kind of, sometimes they didn't, not always, but ultimately, at the core of autoethnography is this idea to resist just authoritatively entering a culture, exploiting the cultural members, and then recklessly leaving to write about the culture for whatever gain that they had, and disregarding the relational ties. In fact, the researcher was expected to disregard the relational ties because that made them biased. That made them unable to produce a scientifically reasonable piece of research if they didn't do that. So the crisis of representation frees the researcher to question these old ways of doing research and to write themselves into what's going on, because effectively what they've done is they've written themselves into the culture by showing up, right? So when we continue on with this, it leads us to wow, to ask some important questions. Okay, so first of all, the researchers begin to say, okay, so what if social science became closer to literature than to physics? Now, before you freak out, it doesn't mean become physics. It doesn't mean become that type of thinking. Okay, it means on the spectrum of things. Okay, if a social science were it was trying to be sort of over here with physics, whereas what if we just sort of inched it over this way a little more toward literature? It doesn't have to be all the way literature, which is way over here where literature is just literature, right? But it wants to sort of make it more like literature, okay? And what if researchers proffered stories rather than theories? There's nothing wrong with theories. We studied a theory last week, okay? There's nothing wrong with theories, but these researchers wanted to be free to say, look, you know what, stories are important. And just because I have stories does not mean I don't have something usable, does not mean that what I've got is not worthy of us looking at, okay? So stories are important. And what these people are saying is it's not that theories are not important, but they're saying stories are as important as theories, okay? Which is an important turn. And then what if researchers, what if us as writers in the scholarly world were self-consciously value-centered, okay, rather than pretending to be value-free? See, this value-free is the unbiased, 100% objective researcher that was supposed to be present in modernist positivist research in social science, okay? There are lots of ways you can work toward being value-free, but what the postmodernist turn did for these researchers is they said, you know what? I don't think I can be value-free, but I'm going to be self-consciously value-centered, which means I'm going to understand what my presence means as much as possible. I'm going to be self-reflexive. I'm going to be introspective. I'm going to understand what's going on, and I'm going to realize that me being there impacts things. It just does. Okay? So these questions are sort of the background to this method that I am asking you to utilize for your final paper, okay? Which you're probably like, okay, crisis of representation, whatever. What am I actually doing? Well, let me explain. Okay, so this is an oversimplified version. In fact, people who do autoethnography in their scholarly research and who publish it would hate this equation. In fact, I have published autoethnographic pieces, and sort of inside of me, I'm like, oh, this equation is too simple. It's too simple, but it gets the point across. Okay, especially for what we're doing this semester. I am not giving you the full-blown autoethnographic explanation. There's so much there. The full-blown explanation of autoethnography. This is just the basics, okay? So ultimately, it's autobiography plus ethnography, okay? So here you go. Autoethnography combines these two things: autobiography, autoethnography, okay? And so let's talk about autobiography first. What are some of the pieces of autobiography that play a role in autoethnography? Okay, so autobiography is where an author retroactively and selectively writes about past experiences, and it's about themselves. And so I am not a genre expert, but autobiography and memoir kind of go together. You're going to take some of those elements, okay? Which ones, Brandon? Well, this, okay? Most often, autobiographers are going to write about epiphanies, okay? So these epiphanies, sort of, you could look at those as remembered moments perceived to have significantly impacted the trajectory of a person's life, okay? So one of the things that especially when I get to the assignment sheet for your final paper, epiphanies are something I think you should look at, okay? Especially when it comes to self-talk and intrapersonal communication and imagined interactions and self-concept and self-esteem and everything we've done all semester, okay? So epiphanies. We also have times of existential crisis that forced a person to attend to and analyze the lived experience. So this is technically an epiphany, but it's a specific type, okay? So you've got the larger epiphanies that you could just examine, but then also there are existential crises. You've got events after which life does not quite seem the same. So it might not be an existential crisis, but there might have been something you experienced, something you did, a person you met, a conversation you had, something where your reality is never the same. We talked in week 1 about how communication is the co-production, transformation, maintenance, and repair of reality. And so you could have some sort of experience where life does not quite seem the same. So, and then to move this forward, then we have ethnography. So autobiography focuses on epiphanies, all right, personal experience and epiphanies. Then you take ethnography. Ethnography is studying a culture's relational practices, common values, beliefs, etc. Okay, this is just sort of a technical definition of ethnography. Ethnography is the thing you hear or think about, and I don't know, maybe you don't think about this, but really what it is ethnography is when the researcher goes to the culture. It's like, this is where you hear the professor or the researcher who's like, I'm getting on a plane to go to Macedonia or wherever they're headed. Does Macedonia even exist right now? I have no idea why I pulled Macedonia out. Let's change that and say they're going to the Australian outback. There we go. And so what they do is they leave and they take their camera and they take their notebooks and they, or now their laptops or whatever, and they get on a plane and they go and they spend 6 months living in the Australian outback with the people who live there. So ethnographers do this by becoming participant observers. So you participate, but you're observing while you participate. So they take field notes of cultural happenings as well as their part in what's going on. Okay, and so that is ethnography. All right, so autobiography plus ethnography gives us autoethnography. Okay, so autoethnography is where you retrospectively and selectively write about epiphanies that stem from or are made possible by being part of a culture and or possessing a particular cultural identity. So for you, what this means is that you are going to be retrospectively and selectively writing about your epiphanies that stem from studying intrapersonal communication. Okay, I'm giving you a very specific context here. You can write about certain things in your life, which we'll get to, but ultimately that's how this works for us in here in this class. In addition to telling about experiences, they're also required to analyze these experiences in a scholarly manner, in an academic manner. So I talked about stories. Stories are going to play an important role. Analysis is also important. Okay, so we're gonna talk about what that looks like as we move forward here. Okay, we're cooking with gas here. We're doing really, really good. So when researchers write autoethnographies, they seek to produce aesthetic and evocative descriptions of intra and interpersonal experience. So I need to stay on this point for just a second. One of the hallmarks of an autoethnography is you're writing about personal experience, okay? You're interweaving scholarly and academic analysis and sources, which I'll get to at the end of this. But the writing of it has to be aesthetic. It has to be evocative, and so the look of it has to be good. It has to sound good. The aesthetic has to feel right. Okay, it has to be well written. And evocative means is that it's not just something that the reader reads. It evokes feelings. It evokes memories. It evokes sensation in the reader of the autoethnography. Okay, you'll see this next week when we engage some examples of autoethnography. The best examples of autoethnography you'll be able to taste when you read it. You'll be able to. It's just good writing is really all it is, but your senses are engaged whenever you do it. Okay, so the autoethnographer tries to make personal experience, and that's what you're going to be writing about in this class. Personal experience. The autoethnographer tries to make that meaningful and tries to make cultural experience engaging. Okay, and so cultural experience here is the larger context of your intrapersonal communication. Your cultural and personal identities at play in the ways that you talk to yourself. Okay, so for some of us, we'll be writing about how our, first, I don't know, autoethnography is so open. The time when you were a kid and you went trick-or-treating and you ran into the homeless person and you had a 5-minute interaction that forever changed the way that you see the world and talk to yourself. Like those type of things are the type of things people write about whenever they do autoethnography. Okay, so the autoethnographer accomplishes this by first discerning patterns of cultural experience. So you're going to be observing yourself. You've done some of that already in your journals, right? You've already been talking about your self-talk. You've already been applying these things. So patterns of cultural experience. We've been doing this in reflecting on our imagined interactions. What sort of patterns are there? Do you continually do these imagined interactions or not? What's going on there? Now, outside of doing what we're doing, there can be interviews, there can be artifacts, stuff like that. For you, it's really just going to be cultural experience, okay? And then you describe them using the facets of storytelling, right? So you create a story for your research is what you're doing, okay? So character, plot development. You show, don't tell. If you've had a writing class on narrative, you've heard that phrase before. And alterations of authorial voice. And so sometimes the best way to articulate it is to write it from personal experience. Sometimes the way to write the story is to write it as a script, and your voice is not really present. You're just. I had a student one time, and it was not for. This is the first time I've taught this class, but I had a student one time in my interpersonal communication class write a conversation between their self-concept and their self-esteem. And so it was their voice, but their voice was not the voice. Does that make sense? So the authorial voice can be shifted. So there's lots of really cool creative ways to get at this and do this type of writing. I'm going to hit pause and get to the next screencast.